This section is about risk management or the risk management plan, which form part of the scoping process or the scoping part of the plan, which form part of the bigger project management plan. When we deal with risk, it's actually interesting to think about where you are doing or planning for risk. So what we are doing in this case, and I feel quite strong about this, is a good place to deal with risk or to plan for risk is in the process of identifying risk. So what are we actually doing at the moment? If you look at the flow over here, you can see we are busy with what? With scoping. Scoping is the process of figuring out what needs to be done in the project. So in the process of scoping, we on the level of scoping, as we break down the project, we use that as a platform to think about risk and risk management and risk management plan. So you will see in the sort of the top left-hand green block, it says developing the detail for the scope. There are 1, 2, 3, 4 keywords over there: inclusions, exclusions, assumptions, and risks. And that is the reason why we are dealing with risks at this moment, because we are going to identify risk as we develop the detail for the project. Okay, so when we deal with risk, we can actually have two components of risk, or two sides of the same coin. We are normally concerned with the negative part to risk, but we shouldn't remember that risk can also be a positive thing, or there could be a positive side to risk. When we talk about the desirable or the positive side of risk, we talk about opportunities. And we are not really going to go into the process of identifying and analyzing and actioning the opportunities. Because in this process, what we are trying to do is we try to maximize the result of the positive risk. But that is why we are in business, and that is why we're executing projects. So we are very much going to focus on the negative side to risk, which are the threats. And the threats can have an impact on the project. And if you say impact, you always ask the question, impact on what? Now remember the three components of a project or a project plan. It is the what or the scope, it is the when or the schedule, it is the how much or the cost. So when you talk about impact in projects, you talk about the impact on one of those three components. Then we have to say, remember why we are practicing project management. Now remember, project management is a proactive tool, you can almost say, to assist you in the process of executing. And remember, we spoke about that earlier. We said you are in a very uncertain environment when you deal with projects. So what you can actually say is, in essence, project management is a risk management tool. So you are practicing projects to reduce the risk of what you are going to do at the end of the day. Good. So when we are talking about risk, we need to know a few things. The first thing we need to know is that risk is inversely proportional to information. So what are we saying? We are saying that the more information you have about something, the less risk you will have. So let's take an example. You are a civil engineering contractor and you are about to put a new pipeline over let's just say a vacant piece of land, or maybe a park in town. You know nothing about what's going on in the ground, so the risk will be high because you don't have information. So you might have might start digging, and you might have a water pipe or electricity pipe, or there might be even some ancient graves or something in there which will jeopardize the project that you are busy with. So less information, high risk. Now you get the job, and you say, wait a minute, I need to know what's in the ground. So you take some trial pits, you do some looking at some information that you have maybe about the area, and from this information you can say, well, I know now there's a pipeline, a water pipeline going there, there's a sewer line going that way, there's some electricity over there, there's no other stuff that I know about from my trial pits about any graves or anything else in the ground that I need to know about, which means I have reduced my risk. I know what's going on in the ground. And in project management, we say we are reducing the risk by adding information, and the process that we use is structured planning in that process. Just remember, risk can never be zero. There's always a chance that something might happen. The chance might be very small, but the risk can never be zero, unless you are taking away that part of the project in which you've identified the risk. So when we are talking about risk and talking about risk management and risk management planning, there's always three components. And it's the same three components that we had with the stakeholder management process: identification, analyze, and action. So what are we going to say in projects or in risk? We're going to say there's actually the action we're going to divide into two parts. So we say first we need to identify the risk. Second, we need to assess the risk. Then we need to respond or develop a response to the risk, and we need to control that going forward. But that last two components, you can say it's about actioning the process that we've now identified and analyzed. When it comes to identifying the risk, so this is the first step in the process, we need to be creative in the process of doing so. So the PMI talks about brainstorming, about information sessions, about getting the community ready, or mobilizing the community. Maybe talk about some professionals or looking at other information that you have from old projects that you have. And the key really here is not to find solutions to the risk, but to identify them. Because the moment you take your mind off identifying to solving, then you're not going to be creative enough to identify the risks that we try to identify. So it's very important in this step, because remember, the risk that you don't know is a difficult one, because you don't know what you don't know, and you can't action what you don't know. So it's very important here that you really take a very broad approach and try to get a big list of risks as big as possible that you can, so that you can go through the analysis process and then says, well, this is not really a risk, it's too low, or it's not really applicable to us, rather than have a risk in there or not in there which is applicable to the project. The second step in the process is to identify or to analyze the risk. So we've already identified the risk now, and now, the same way as we had with the stakeholder management, we want to know what that means, what this list of risks actually means. So in our process, we need to say, what is the size of the risk that we have? And the thing about risk, it's a very difficult thing to quantify. In a big sense, a risk is just a feeling that you have, almost a feeling in your gut. It's like walking around in a dangerous area and you feel, wow, I don't feel safe here. I feel like there's a big risk that someone might mug me or whatever. So, but that is difficult to quantify a feeling. So what we are saying in the process of analysis, we say, let's determine the size of the risk by combining two parts to risk. And that is the impact and the probability. Impact means the size of the bad thing that will happen to the project. And again, we talk about impact. We say impact on what? Our scope, or our performance, or our quality, and or our schedule, and or the cost of the project. So that's always where you will scale that. You'll look at some scale in terms of that. And then you will look at what is the probability that this event might occur that can have a negative effect on one of those aspects of our project. What you then say is you can actually determine a equivalent value from that by multiplying them to each other. And what you will do then is you'll use a threshold approach. Now you can say, wait a minute, I have a quantitative value of the size of the risk. I can say in my own opinion, or in my project, is what and how I will deal with those sizes of risks, and then it's easier to action that later on. So you're going to see in the example now what I mean by the threshold value, or the appetite, the risk appetite that I have to assist me in the process of actioning my risk. So the third step in the process is action. Now that we have quantified our risk, we have quantified our threshold values, which sort of shows us, or is an indication of the risk appetite that we have. you can now basically go and you can categorize your risk in terms of their size into how you will action or what you will action in terms of the risk that you've identified. So we talk about a risk strategy is the action towards the risks that I've identified. And in that process, you can have, well, actually, you can have four categories of that. If the risk is very, very small, you're going to say, like, wait a minute, I don't really want to get anything in place. It's small enough so that if it happens, I'll take it. I'll just go on and I'll make a plan around that. If the risk is a bit bigger, we will identify what we call a contingency plan. A contingency plan is a plan B. A plan B is something which you won't execute unless the risk actually happens or the event actually happens. So it's a plan B. It sits outside of your project plan. If the risk becomes bigger, you'll have a mitigation plan in place. And a mitigation plan means a plan A. So you get something in place so that you are reducing the risk by already actioning the risk. And then if the risk is really too big, you will say, I'm not going to accept the risk. I'm going to pass this on, and I'm going to either reduce the component in my project, or I'll let management decide, because these are devastating stuff. These are really big bad stuff that can happen to our projects. So let's look at an example, just a very simple quantitative example, very low level risk assessment tool or process. Over there you can see we've identified 5 risks, A to E. We've added probabilities to them. So in this case we're using a scale from 1 to 10, where 10 is a very high probability that it might happen, and 0 or 1 is a very low probability that the risk might happen or occur. Then we've identified the impacts of these risks. So again, scale of 1 to 10, low being a very low impact on either or my scope, cost, and schedule. And then I've multiplied those with each other to get an equivalent value. So that is specific to my project. This is specific to my risks. Now what I will do is I'll go to my project plan and I'll say, what is my threshold? What is my appetite towards risk in my project? And you'll set up a threshold table like I have over there. Say, for example, if the risk is between 0 to 10, I'll have a low risk. I'll accept that. If it's between 11 and 40, medium risk, I'll get contingencies in place. 41 and 75, I'll have a high risk, get mitigation in place. And if it's higher than 75, I will just pass this on. I will pass it on. I'll give management the decision, or I might even need to remove that part of the project that the risk is associated with. Okay, and then what I will do, I will physically go, I'll say risk number B is 24. 24 is on my second band. I'll have a contingency in place, and then I'll quantify those contingencies. I'll say exactly how I will action those activities. And that's it. That's the plan. That's what you'll do. But we can make it easier for us to make it more visual, and that's what the next slide is about. So in the previous slide, I showed you a very simple, very low-level example of a quantitative risk assessment. And that's the whole process. But you can actually make your life very easy if you can use some sort of a matrix or a visual tool to assist you with this process. And this is what this slide is about. You take a graph. On the one side, you've got the impact. Remember, we used a scale of 1 to 10 in the impact. On the bottom scale, we use the probability. And again, we've used the same scale, 1 to 10 or 0 to 10. And according to the previous sort of assessment that we've done in the previous slide, you can go and plot your risk on the slide. And the bands on the slide represent your threshold values. So now you can say, if the risk is in the red, I know it's a high risk. I need to go and talk to my management about it. If it's in the yellow, maybe it's a contingency. If it's in the orange, it's a mitigation. And if it's in the yellow, it is something that's not yellow, the green, it is low, and I will accept that. I'll just go on with the project. So this is just a nice visual tool that we can use to help us with this process. Just remember, the output is important. What is the output of a risk assessment process? Is the actions. So that list of of not generically, I'm going to have a mitigation in place or a contingency in place, but tell them exactly what mitigation you'll have on that specific risk and what mitigation or what contingency you're going to have on another risk. That is very important. And then to conclude this section on risk, there's just a few things I want to also bring under your attention. The first thing is that of a risk trigger. So a risk trigger is something that will increase either probability or the impact of a risk, maybe the probability more than the impact. So just an example of this is if you are working in a factory or on a site or a construction site, then something like let's say overtime hours might trigger people on site getting hurt more often. So have a look at that when you are setting up your project risk plan, and be aware of those and monitor those so that you know when you can expect your risks to, the probability of risk to become more, to happen more often. Then I like to talk about the causality of risk. It might be that you have two independent risks sitting next to each other. So let's say you are, your project is some sort of electronic project that you work with electronic stuff. You're working in a warehouse somewhere, and you've identified at certain place in the risk, you've identified that there are cabinets that's stacked quite high, and that these cabinets can fall over, and if someone is there or working there, they might get hurt or even die. You went through a whole analysis process and you've realized that it's got a very low equivalent value because the probability that these cabinets might fall over is very low, although the impact might be fairly high. Someone gets hurt or maybe killed. The equivalent value is low, so you say, it's all right, I'll just take it, or maybe get a contingency plan in place. Next to that, you've identified another risk. The risk is maybe there's some material or wiring lying on the ground. You've identified the risk that someone might trip over and fall, and you've done the analysis and you've realized that it's a very low risk, low equivalent value because you might just maybe get bruised or hurt an arm or something. It's no big impact on the project. So you've got two risks with low equivalent values. Okay, but what happens if someone walks, fall over the wiring, fall against the cabinets, and then let the cabinet fall on top of someone else? So can you see what I'm saying? It's not just about the individual risks that we have over here. It's about the links between the risk, the causality about between the risks, and always make sure or double check those. Another thing that we need to look at is the risks which has got low probability but very high impact. We call these the acts of nature. These are your tsunamis and your terrorist attacks and those stuff that the probability might be very small, but if it happens, it can be devastating for the project. It's always good to just go and revisit these and look at what might be triggers in there as well, or causality in there as well. Okay, and then lastly, we must always remember when we talk about these sub projects, like a project risk plan, project risk management plan, these are living documents. So you are setting it up in the planning phase, but through the project you're going to use that as a living document to assist yourself in the process of adding new risk if needed, or removing risk if there was a risk that you've identified but doesn't really occur in the project. So that's why I'm calling this a living document that assists you for the risk throughout the project. And the nice thing about this living document, the living plan of the risk management plan, is that in the next project, the first thing that you will do when you're trying to identify your risk, you will grab your project risk management plan from your previous project and you'll look at it and you'll say, what are the projects that I've identified prior to the project? And what are the risks that sort of surfaced from the projects that I can also add to this list? So it becomes almost like project information capital. It's information that you can use from the one project to the next. And that is risk management.